F. Schattenberg, Schattenberg, 5016 41 Street South, St. Petersburg, Florida. Phone 813-867-1853, Tuesday, February the 21st, 1989, with Helen Earley of the Oldsmobile History Center. Location was Mr. Schattenberg's home in St. Petersburg. Tape 1 of 1 tape.
I have this.
Oh, you've got a sheet already,
Yeah,
Harold.
there it is. I wrote
Oh,
down
great.
who I worked for, how many years,
Well,
what
let's
departments I worked in.
go through
Certainly.
that, and you hired in when at Oldsmobile?
1950.
Okay. Who hired you in?
All right, I worked for, well, Don Perkins hired me, but my first boss was George Hirschman.
I see. Now, you were hired directly into product engineering?
Yes.
As a what?
Records clerk. Senior engineering clerk is the way all of us came in as engineers to product engineering in 1950, 1949 for that matter, too.
I see. Now, what was your job as a senior engineer?
Just kept records of cars, testing, mileage, took care of the parts change notices, showed, we had books of cars, and then each car had a breakdown of the various special parts that were on test when they went on test and when they came off of test, and then we followed up on the tests that were run, the analysis, the conclusions of test, any failures, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Who else was working with you?
At that time, Fred Miller came in, Frank Ball was there, Walt Freiberg was in there, Ken Sliders, Jack Wallace, John Belts, who went up to be general manager of Oldsmobile eventually. Those are the ones I remember offhand.
And George Hirschman was your immediate?
George Hirschman was my first supervisor, yes.
And who did he report to?
He reported to, well, the assistant experimental engineer, who was Jim Lewis.
I see.
And he was replaced then, George was replaced by Adrian Smith, for whom I worked. And then he got moved on, and then I worked for Fred Miller a while, and all those jobs as a senior engineering clerk.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went into the lab, engineering laboratory.
Okay, now what building was that in?
That was in the same building, 64.
64.
And I worked for Ralph Berg.
Okay, what did you do in the lab?
Set up tests.
What kind of tests?
These were car part tests of various components. The same kind of parts that were tested perhaps at the proving ground on cars. We did testing in the laboratory, much accelerated tests. We could get hundreds of thousands of cycles in a short time. And as the parts broke or whatever, we'd look at them, or the engineer responsible would look at them and make an analysis, get the parts fixed, corrected, revised, whatever, and test them again.
What kind of parts?
These are all, well, brakes for one thing, springs were in on test.
Where would those springs be on the car then?
Well, they were the suspension, chassis springs, regular
see.
suspension springs, heavy duty sort of things.
Okay.
We tested steering knuckles, radiator, yeah, we tested radiators.
How would you test radiators?
Well, we would put them under pressure and then release the pressure and pressurize it again and release the pressure.
Now, how do you do that?
Well, with the air system and a timer and a pressure control device, and we would keep the radiators heated up. In fact, I remember warming up the laboratory test room so much that the fumes were all over the room. Everybody came downstairs. They thought there was a fire in there. It wasn't. It was just my way of getting the things all heated up. It was pretty impressive.
Well, how did you do that physically, though?
We ran steam through coils, okay, in a bath of antifreeze. and then we just let that stuff go up. It was pretty smelly in there too. Another thing we tested was when General Motors went over to the 12-volt system. We
Is that a battery?
that was, yes, the whole electrical system. We kept this 6-volt starter. I'm trying to remember this. I'm sure we kept the 6-volt starter, but put 12 volts to it, and we tested to see if the flywheel would stand up under this jar, because the starter motor got twice the voltage it normally would have gotten in the previous years when it was a 6-volt system. And I replaced many flywheels.
You had a certain...
That was I'm trying to think how many engines. We had at least a dozen, if not 2 dozen engines running all the time, starting and stopping, starting and stopping.
On stands?
On stands, yes, And run them just long enough to get them fired up, then we'd shut the engine down, then we'd start again. That was my job, to make sure they were running, kept running, and...
were these all 8-cylinder engines?
These were the V8s, yes. This was 1954, 55. We were doing that. And, well, as I say, other car components, the brakes were having a problem with the handbrake, and somebody brought a new design and it didn't work, and so we fixed it and we tested it, and it didn't work, and we fixed it and we tested it, and so on, until it became acceptable. And then I went to work, as we used to say, I went upstairs. That was the big move.
When was
upstairs in 1955.
Okay.
If you were downstairs was where all the work went on. Upstairs was where your career really started. Even though that record section was upstairs, going upstairs meant you started to get into the professional end of your business. And I'd been already working 5 years, not really as an engineer. Then I started working for Al Baker on heating, car heaters, and ventilation and defrosting and air conditioning.
What did you do in that area?
We took cars, well, we would test components and see how well they worked or if they didn't work. And we worked very closely with Harrison Radiator Division, who made most of the components, and with Frigidaire, who made the compressor. And I worked in air conditioning for 20 years. And in that job, I went to Phoenix many times looking for hot weather in the summer. Then we'd go to Cadillac, Michigan, or Indian River, Michigan, looking for cold weather in the winter. We would go to Colorado Springs or to Florida in between, looking for the warmer, cool weather. We went to Gunnison once, and I found out since that's one of the ice boxes of the United States. Every once in a while they mention the coldest spot, and it's Gunnison. Well, we went there in the middle of September looking for below freezing temperatures, and we found it in the morning. And then in between those, I would go to Lockport about every month and a half. Lockport, New York, where Harrison Radiator Division had their test tunnels, and we would test cars for heating performance and defrosting and for air conditioning.
How would you test a car in a test tunnel?
Well, for example, we'd take a car and set the temperature in the cold tunnel to 0 degrees and let the car soak there for 3 hours.
Soak?
Soak. The car would sit, would sit,
in this
doors and everything open, sit in this cold environment with the wind blowing maybe 10 miles an hour, 0 degrees, to make sure everything was at 0 degrees in the car. And then the car would be started up, and it would be instrumented to determine temperatures, and we would watch the temperatures as they went up, and if they didn't go up in a certain spot, we had floor grids, as we called them, with temperature sensors, thermocouples. And if one of them was cold, then we figured we'd have to do some changing in the inside of the heater to get some air moved over there, so because it would represent where passengers' feet were, and so they would have a cold foot, for example, so we'd have to make sure some air went over there. We would also ride these cars and get into them at 0 degrees and see if we personally were comfortable. We'd get 4 people in the car. We'd ride it for half an hour perhaps and just get to warm up.
Right
in the tunnel.
In the tunnel?
Yes. We would simulate driving on the road, which we did then in Cadillac, Michigan, and these various other places.
I was going to ask you about
jump
that.
in the car, sometimes at 4 a.m., I'd ride the car for an hour, and I would jump in another car at 5 a.m. and ride it for an hour, and we would ride these cars and see what our comfort level was. We would make changes then. We'd hire a garage, local garage somewhere to use a space. We'd take a mechanic with us, and we'd change components in the car right there, and test them then. We'd ride them during the day, see how we were. And we'd take them to dinner at night, and again, everybody was always, you never took a joyride. There was always some analysis going on of something. How are you in the left rear seat? Well, pretty good, pretty bad, and so on.
So actually, an important part of your job was to keep accurate records.
Oh,
observe and
absolutely,
keep
yes.
accurate
We
records.
wrote reports and reports, yes. All of these data were compiled and eventually into graphs and charts, and eventually a report would be issued. Nobody told me to do it, but I finally decided what the boss wanted to know is, does it work or doesn't it work? So I decided to put the conclusion at the start of the report. I found out now that that's what's being advised to do. Because if you got a busy boss and he's got a dozen people reporting to him, does it work or doesn't it? Tell me about it. And you tell them in the first paragraph.
I see.
And that's what I did. Then, after the air conditioning, heating, ventilating, I went into worked in the engine group.
Now, what year was that?
1976.
Who was your...
I worked, my first boss, well, there was Harry Lyons was in there, and I can't think of his name now. He's now vice president of the corporation too.
Bob Stemple?
No, he's a vice president. Stemple's president now, of course. This was, well, I'll think of his name in a minute. Anyway, I worked for those two, and then eventually Jim Benner got promoted to in charge of the engine group, and then Tom Leonard, and I worked for Joe Jones, and I also worked for Arnie Johnson in the engine group. And in the engine group, the reason I got into the engine group is they were expanding it because they were doing the diesel engine. So I worked on some parts of the diesel engine.
What did you actually do on these parts?
Well, I was responsible for the cylinder heads, for example, and the valve gear. And so any tests that went on, back to the laboratory again, there were test cells where engines were put on stands. They were hooked up for water and all sorts of temperature type of instrumentation, and then hooked up to a machine that would put reverse power into the engine, so the engines would have to work, and then the operators, or the engine control operators, would have a program that they would set the engines up to go full throttle, wide open throttle, as if the car was going uphill at 60 miles an hour, for example. Then it would coast a while, then it would idle a while, and it would go through this cycle over and over again. You'd have to do so many cycles before you decide that whatever you had on test would be worthwhile putting out for the public. So I worked on cylinder heads, and what I did was I followed up with the vendors. We tried to get them to improve the quality of their cast iron, the quality of the dimensional integrity of the parts as they were shipped to us. I worked on valves, worked with the valve vendors, worked on valve springs, worked with them, worked on a lot of work on the camshaft. The diesel engine had to have a special camshaft in it, and I worked with sources to get a good source to make good camshaft.
Who else is source of our...
Well, CWC was the one that finally made our camshafts. The first camshafts were made by Central Foundry. That was the original design of camshaft. Then the metallurgy of it was changed, and Central Foundry got out of it, and we had the camshafts then made by, so we went out for bids to various places, and who had the best kind of iron to make these, and the experience and so on, and CWC anyway made them, which I understand are out of business now.
I see. Who was chief engineer when you were on the diesel?
Okay, Bob Dorshimer.
Bob Dorshimer.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Incidentally, Bob Dorshimer was in the records department at one time also.
Is that right?
Starting back in 1949 or something like that. Yeah.
What kind of a man was he to work with?
Well, he was my boss by about three times removed, but we had gone to sport car races together and so forth. And so we had a friendly personal relationship. So, you know, it was whenever he wanted something to do, he'd sit down and say, I want you to do something or other. Why don't you do this? I want to try that. Or what do you think about this or that? It was never bombastic sort of orders from the boss, but I knew he was the boss, and he said what he wanted. So I got it for him. And he'd tell me to try something. I'd go in his office and say, Bob, I'm going to work. Well, try it this way. Then we'll try it that way. And I'd finally say, he says, okay, let's go on to something else. Or he'd say, hey, my boss, whoever that might be somewhere, says, well, I got to do it, whatever. So I just keep on beating on it.
Do you remember any certain incident of where you had to keep struggling to...
Well, yeah, body ventilation. Ed Cole decided he wanted to have a certain method of ventilating. This had to be about 1967. We tried and did this, that, and the other thing, and we started getting into some car component changes, which had to be done by Fisher Body. Now you're starting to get into some pretty heavy stuff. And they said, go for it, see whatever it takes to do it. So we did, and the bodies were reconstructed, and that's the way the ventilation worked. It took us, I'd say, a good year to work this out.
How was that type of ventilation different than what
Well,
you had been
they used to have these, what they call the controlled vents, the little CV windows in the front windows of the cars.
Right.
And they decided to get rid of them, and so they had to have some way to get flow through ventilation, and that's how that was what started this whole thing. We finally wound up putting holes in the deck lid and some holes in the pillar posts and some little rubber flapper valves so that you couldn't have reverse airflow in there, that sort of thing.
What about some of your trips to the proving ground in, say, Phoenix?
Phoenix, we would many times drive our test cars out there. We would take a control car, which would be say, a last year's model, and use that as a comparison, and take the new, maybe 2 years down the road car with a lot of fiberglass pieces in it to represent the interior of the car. And we would then test this new car, and the standard car, and if too, would be filled with all sorts of air conditioning parts that we knew we were going to test. We would generally take a mechanic with us, so there'd be the boss and me, the test engineer out of the experimental department, and a mechanic. And we'd have 2 or 3 cars, and so we'd all take off and drive down the road.
Now, on one of those trips, who would be your test, the mechanic?
The mechanic would be out of our experimental
Do you
garage.
remember any?
Yeah, Dick Manhennick, for one, was one that went with us.
And
on
the boss, you said?
The boss was my Al Baker. Later on, I worked for Al Baker for 8 years, and then he retired, and Bill Jackson took his place, and I worked for Bill for 12 years. And I must say, it was an enjoyable relationship I had with Bill. It was as much personal as it was boss. Every once in a while, we'd get in a discussion, he'd finally say, stop, you got to do it this way, okay, not go on with it. But it was mostly working with rather than working for. And I, as I say, enjoyed that relationship very much.
Well, so now the car that you'd be taking out to test, or the 3 cars, they wouldn't look like a new car.
They would all be, well, one of them that would be the comparison car would be a current model car, maybe let's say a 1970. And then we'd be working on a 1973, and the interior of that car, if the instrument panel were different, that would be the reason we'd be doing it, or had a new air conditioning system. We would take the car, reworked in the experimental assembly department, and then experimental sheet metal would make whatever had to be made for the car, weld it in place. Our model shop would make fiberglass skins representing whatever new instrument panel we would have, and then we would cobble in a speedometer, whatever else we had to make the car work. And the car could spend a month in the experimental assembly, being put together with various components to make it represent the new car.
Almost handcrafted, right?
Absolutely, every bit of it handcrafted. I spent a lot of my time upside down underneath the instrument panel, making sure that various components were put in there. I couldn't tell a mechanic how to do it necessarily. The designers on the drafting board hadn't even got around to the point of what did we want from them yet? So there was a lot of sitting around drawing sketches back and forth between the boss and me, and maybe the experimental engineer might be involved in it, and we just go at it. Sometimes a mechanic, whoever was working with us, would have an idea and say, hey, why don't you try this, do this or something, because he would know what he could do or build better than we could. Sometimes you can give a skilled tradesperson a drawing of something they should make, and they're going to look at you and say, you can't get there from here. So we would use their advice and work with them.
Do you remember any work stoppages?
You mean from strikes or anything of that nature?
Yes.
You mean? No, never, ever had a problem in that regard. I went through, of course, several strike areas, and the guys would say howdy to me when I walked in the door if we were on strike, and I would either catch up work on my desk. Yeah, there would be a work stoppage in as much as we wouldn't have any mechanics in there, and we, of course, were not allowed to touch the car. They would have roving shop stewards wandering through the facilities to make sure some engineer didn't wind up turning a nut or bolt or something. We knew we shouldn't do that, and we didn't. We were happy to just get in the building to be able to catch up on our correspondence, perhaps, and work with our drafting people, designers, and we just waited out.
Now, what year might that have one of
Well,
these
this was throughout the years, you know, when I was,
the
whenever
50s?
we had strikes, you could count
I see.
those years, and every one of them, they never locked us out entirely. In fact, the guys knew when they were going to go on strike, and they'd laugh and say, okay, we're going to have some time off. You guys got to go and work. We're going to fix it up, so you guys got to work. So it was, I would say that working in product engineering, all the personnel worked together very well, from the lowest paid to the highest paid, really.
And you work primarily in building 66?
64 and 66,
64.
yes.
Then when
The
did
new
you
building.
go over to 66?
The day it was still had fresh plaster in it.
Okay.
Whatever year was that, 64 or something like that.
I think so.
Yeah, I watched it being built. Saw them tear the houses down on the street and watched them dig the holes and build it, and yeah. And we all marched over there one weekend, took our stuff over, and we're doing business that next Monday.
You remember, now, did you work for Mr. Wolfram? He was,
He was general manager, and he was about 14 steps up the ladder from me.
I see. Okay.
Our orders might come from him in the manner that I was working on heater's end, that Mrs. Wolfram's left foot was cold in the car. What would we do about that? Well, we would say, can we have Mrs. Wolfram's car in here? We'll fix her car up for her personally. Now, sometimes it was something we could do, and it would go into production too, but otherwise sometimes it was just something they wanted special. We'd do it for them, obviously.
Yes. Did you get a lot of special requests like that to
Oh,
handle a number of them?
mostly only when the new cars went out every fall, and all the supervisors got their assigned cars, their driving-by cars, and they didn't like this, that, and the other thing, and we would fix up this, that, and the other thing. That's one of the perks of being boss.
Too. Well, then that car's all ready to
It's already,
sell to somebody
yeah, to
else
somebody
for the
else,
bug
yeah,
zone.
certainly, right, whatever it might have been.
I see.
Yeah, sometimes we wondered if we were chasing something that was there or not, but the boss is a boss, whatever he says, we'll fix it. I enjoyed my relationship with all the people at Oldsmobile all the years I was there.
Who would be your favorite boss, would you say?
Oh, Bill Jackson, who has now died. He retired and got ill about immediately, and I don't think he lasted 3 years. In fact, he retired in Sarasota. I went there to see him one time, and he'd already died. I didn't know that. But yeah, he was, as I say, I worked with him rather than for him.
Would you go often down to Milford?
Yes, I'd go to Milford, again, to run our special cars, whatever there might be there, or see to it that our components, new heaters were changed. We'd make a run in the thing. It wouldn't necessarily be any given hot or cold temperature, but just to see how it was running. And if it wasn't right, we'd have the parts changed. We never did any, per se, testing at Milford on our stuff. It was mostly in Phoenix, or at Cadillac, Michigan, or Indian River, or Colorado Springs, or in Harrison Tunnels. The Milford thing was mainly to put miles in.
I see.
And our parts weren't necessarily a car heater is going to outlast the car, of course.
Colorado Springs, do you remember any interesting incidents that might have happened there?
I remember quite a few people getting drunk there after a long day's work. You finally got to let go, and a lot of interesting weekends. But as far as our work there, yeah, what we did in Colorado Springs, we'd take cars up in the mountains and leave them sit overnight. I don't think you'd dare do that anymore, but we'd leave them sit up there, and it'd be about an hour and a half drive, and let the cars soak overnight. We'd go back into town because there's nothing in between. And the next morning we'd get up about 4:30, get to the car, run it around up there a while, and then run it back into town. Those made long days.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have trouble starting the car after?
We weren't in the kind of a thing that the carburetor guys were in, where they were looking at 30 degrees below zero weather. So we were looking for zero. And so we never had a problem starting it. I remember one instance in Indian River where the hotel we stayed at, this was about 1960, I'd say, and they had not built up all the motels they had there. We stayed in a hotel, old wooden hotel with buckled floors and the doors that almost fit, and the dining room downstairs, and we would leave the car sit outside all night, and we'd take off the next morning. Well, we got into the F-85 model, which was a smaller car at that time. We're testing heaters on that, and we jumped in the car one morning and it would not go. The engine revved, put it in gear, and you could hear the wheels. What's wrong with this? So we got out. That wrecked the test, because you're supposed to start from dead cold engine. We got out and found out that one of our people that were working with us from one of the other divisions had become friendly with some of the local people there at the bar. And the local people decided to have a little fun, so they had picked up the back end of the car and shoved a box underneath it. So we put it in gear. It wouldn't go anywhere.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Strictly harmless prank, of course, but then we had to work at getting this stupid car up in the air again. And got the bumper jack out and picked the car up enough to kick the box out of there, and then we decided, well, can we save this test or can't we save this test? But, well, that was a little horseplay, but...
Did you have problems with the aluminum engine?
No, we did not have any problem with it. I worked in the lab at the time. They had a problem with the aluminum engine plugging up the radiator. And I ran a test over one lunch hour with taking a couple of pieces of that aluminum engine. I hooked them up to a battery and I stuck the pieces into some antifreeze. And I went to lunch and I came back, and the one piece was shiny bright and the other one had all kind of fuzz on the thing. Well, that's what the engine was doing, due to stray electrical currents, which you have in a car engine. Well, this aluminum engine was doing that and messing around with the copper radiator and the aluminum engine, and it made this fuzz. And so anyway, Wyandotte Chemical came to the rescue. They had an antifreeze that didn't do that. In fact, I'd say Wyandotte had not really had big business at Olds till that time. But with that situation, they were in good shape for about good 5 to 6 years. They had a very healthy piece of the antifreeze market. Incidentally, antifreeze, when I worked on heating, ventilating, and air conditioning, I was also given the job of engine cooling, because I asked for it. I had done the heater work so much, I said, look guys, I can do this asleep with my left toe, Let me have some more assignments. So they gave me that. And I worked on the radiators, and antifreeze is part of it, so the vendors would come in and we would put their antifreeze on test, or they would have it on test, and they all had these magic mouse milk, moose juice formulas. They wouldn't tell you what was in it. That was their magic. Well, finally, General Motors says, okay, that's enough of this business. So somewhere in the 60s, General Motors decided they were going to, maybe this early 70s, get into, rather than coming up with an antifreeze formula, coming up with a performance specification. I'll tell you guys what this antifreeze has to do, and instead of approving this guy's AJ41 and this one guy's ABCX and so on, you have got to meet General Motors spec number. I used to know.
Okay, we're in business, Hero.
Yes, and rather than have them have these various designations, 801A, for example. We came out with a GM spec, and they had to meet that. It must do this, must do that, must do that. Must have a shelf life of 2 years, for example, sit in a can and not separate out so a customer could dump it in their car and so on and be okay. And the bidding then, well, the bidding war just about ended because they had to all come up with this. And I remember a man by the name of Roe, R-O-E, in the tech center, who was an expert on corrosion, who pretty well, I'd say, developed the formula for the specs to do this. He knew all the formulas these guys had in their antifreeze because he had analyzed it. So, yeah, that was one job.
Well, it was quite something. Then that was a bidding system after that, but it was a little different because...
Yes, it was. Yeah, and whoever got the bid that year was in good shape. And then the rest of them had to scramble for next year's business. Of course, then they go into the aftermarket business. And we had DuPont in there a little while. It was pretty heavy going there for a while. I had some big companies coming and almost pleading to get a piece of the business. And I'm sitting behind the desk and I'm saying, what do you guys got? What can you do for me? I work with vendors a lot. Oh, that's funny. One of the men who's now vice president of corporations said, I don't want you engineers to call these people vendors. He says, those are the people that put candy in the candy machines. He says, they're suppliers. I felt like telling them they'd already been upgraded to vendor. They used to be called peddlers. So anyway, but I did work with the suppliers. Harrison Radiator, for example, their salespeople. Frigidaire. Worked with lots of plastic companies because I was in the era where things on the car changed from die-cast over to plastic. And again, there were no plastic specifications. So I learned a lot about plastics. I had some suppliers lie to me about plastics, but I asked each other all these same questions that finally one guy would say this and I'd ask somebody else what the answer, no, that's wrong, that's wrong. I asked a third guy and pretty soon I'd make my own analysis of what was right and wrong about all of this stuff. And GM finally came up with a performance specification on the plastics again, rather than we'll use Monsanto's this or Foster Grant that or something of that nature. That all disappeared off the drawings. Now must meet spec so and so, and they'll have to meet that. The temperature specs. The worst thing is the vendors always wanted to cheat by putting regrind, the reground plastics of their plastic manufacturing back into the product. The only thing that happened there would be that the temperature resistance would be degraded. Instead of the plastic standing up to 190 degrees, it would only be good for 160 degrees. Well, a black car in Phoenix in the summer, it gets very hot. In fact, we would incidentally talk about soaking the cars in the Harrison Tunnel. We would soak the cars for heating purposes for 3 hours, so everything would get down to zero. Well, we would soak the car for 1 hour to get everything up to I think it was 100 degrees or 115, I forgot which, in the tunnel. It heated up much quicker than it cooled down. And then we would test the car that way in the tunnel. Well, we would set the car out in Phoenix for an hour and get into it and drive it with the windows closed to start with. And I'll tell you, taking off was hot. You couldn't touch the steering wheel with just your fingertips to start with. And when I worked for Al Baker, he insisted we sit in the car and take all our initial readings, and everybody's just dripping perspiration. So when he left the job and Bill Jackson got on, I changed that performance, that program. I said, guys, we are going to hop in the car and we're going to take numbers as we roll out of here and get the air conditioner going now. Because we know what temperature the car is inside to start with. We've had it out there for an hour. We've done this on umpty times. So we weren't quite as uncomfortable. In fact, we used to also, back to heating, we used to run a car for an hour and a half, full heat. Well, full heat at 0 degrees. You start out with an overcoat and you wind up taking off your overcoat and sweater and everything else. I made the test so it ran for half an hour, not an hour and a half. And we would, after everybody was comfortable in the car, then we would temper the heat. So I think the old timers felt that you had to have pain and be uncomfortable to show you're doing a job. And I guess I'm of a newer breed than that, and I decided, no, I don't think I had that much pain to prove I'm doing my work. But the generation that came up before me came through the 1930s, and they were very possessive of their jobs. They weren't about to have any reason why they shouldn't stay employed, obviously. I'm sure that had to be very difficult for them, being engineers in the 30s. Well, in fact, all the bosses at the time I started working in 50 had come up through the 1930s. It had been a horrendous time. I heard some of their stories. But again, to repeat, I enjoyed Oldsmobile. Now, my final job at Olds, I retired in 1982. I was 60 at the time. And months went by, and I was bored stupid. I was still in Lansing. So they called me up and said, "You want to go back to work?" And I almost asked them if they wanted me to pay for the privilege, but I knew better than that. So I went to work for 4 more years as, well, they called me a consultant. I did the same kind of work I'd done before, but I worked in the chassis group. I had been in the experimental department when I worked in the lab. Then I went in the development section when I was on air conditioning and on engines. Then I went into the chassis group when I worked the last 4 years, not as an old employee per se, but as a consultant.
Now, who was your supervisor then? Who did you report to?
My immediate supervisor was, I can see his, Fran Otto Kern, that's what
Otto Kern, uh-huh.
Yeah, because she knows it. Anyway, Otto Kern was my boss. He's the one that called me up and said, "Hey, you want to go to work?" So he was my boss, but under him was another boss.
Who was he?
They changed them around. Sullivan was one of them.
Floyd Sullivan?
Floyd Sullivan, yeah. I worked for him for a while. Not on the project I started out on. I worked under him on steering. But to start out with, I was hired in to work with Ronnie Brown. And he was a project engineer on engine mounting, the new 4-cylinder engine that Oldsmobile has, a 16-valve quad 4. And so I worked with and for Ronnie Brown. His job was to go out and run the cars. He'd be out of town. I'd be in Lansing. He'd call me up from Phoenix and say, "I need a whatever it is." We'd have a few pieces of this, that, or the other made up. He says, "And I need them now." So I'd get them packaged up, and I'd make sure they got to the airport and flown out to them that day. And we would take cars and put them on a surface plate, set everything up proper dimensionally. Then we would get this engine and set it in place, and then we would build engine mounts around this engine to test the engine. People don't, what's an engine mount anyway? Well, that's what keeps the engine from falling on the cement. And they're very, very important, and nobody knows that because nobody would know one if they saw it. But basically, it's a couple of pieces of metal with a brick of rubber bonded between them. And one piece of metal hooks to the engine, the other piece hooks to the car frame. And but it's where you locate these, and the hardness of the rubber and the shape of the brackets is, well, it's a state-of-the-art thing. There is no way you can stick that in a computer. You can put it in the computer after you've designed it, and then it'll help you to design another. But if you start with something out of the sky, well, with experience, you know something that's going to kind of work, and you go from there. So I worked with Ronnie Brown for a couple of years on that, and that was interesting because I was kind of on my own there. I worked with the sheet metal people a lot.
Who were in sheet metal?
Pardon me?
Who was in sheet metal?
Trying to remember. I can see these Harold Hazen? No, Harold not. Harold, somebody who was in charge of something there now. Anyways, first name is Harold. Through his men, he'd loan somebody for me, and he'd push his toolbox out to the job, and we would fit pieces to it, and he'd go back and weld them up, and we'd try them out, and if it didn't work, we'd break it apart or make a new one or whatever. They'd make brackets right on the job to fit. And then Ronnie'd say, "That's good, I need 3 more." So I'd have to take it off the car and get somebody to draw a picture of the thing. And then we'd get some more pieces made. Then it'd get tested, and then I'd say he'd be out west and I'd be doing uh, some parts of his job while he was gone. That was interesting because it was right from the ground up. There wasn't anybody else to tell us how or what to do.
That
And
was on the quad 4 engine.
yes, that was engine mounts for the quad 4 engine.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed the experience. But I told Ronnie several times, Ronnie, I'm the best guy you will ever have working for you. I said, I'm experienced. I know how to get a job done, and I don't want your job. In fact, I'm going to make you look good. I want you to get a promotion. I said, now how many people in this building are going to say that to somebody else? I said, I'm set. I'm retired. I said, we're going to have some fun here. And we did. And we did a good job. So, and then I finally wound up into working on steering for a while.
What did you do on steering?
Well, they needed somebody left. A gal that went to Princeton to get an advanced degree. Susan Moore. I took her job. She'd come in and taken over part of that, working on the J car, steering. And somebody else had the N car, and he was the boss of it, and I can't remember his name either. He sat right next to me. Anyway, I took over her job on the J car steering, the components and any failures, and then talked to Saginaw Steering Gear, and their people would come in, or we would go there, and there would be test apparatus set up to cycle the things back and forth until they broke. And that job came to an end, and I went to work in squeak and rattle, as they call it, noise elimination in the car. Anything that came loose wasn't supposed to come loose. I worked with Fisher Body personnel on that. And that was one of my final jobs there, was in squeak and rattle. The other thing is, a squeak had to be pretty loud with me in my early 60s to be hearing it, because your hearing inevitably in the higher frequencies goes. You might hear rattles, but not the squeaks. In fact, I'd ride around with these young guys and say, boy, that's a terrible squeak. Guess what squeak? So,
Who were you reporting to on the squeaks and rattles?
I'm trying to think, was it? Yeah. Boy, I've lost, I know all the old names and not the new ones. Bob. Fran? Remember the guy I worked with on Squeak and Rattle? Bob, what's his name there? The Italian name? Yeah. Yeah, anyway, Bob. Nice guy to work with. Well, I worked with rather than for. He wasn't really boss. He was in charge because he was there in place.
And then under the on the chassis area when you were there, who did you report with to?
Well,
when you were a consultant.
well, first I worked with Ronnie, and then Otto Kern.
Otto Kern.
Yeah, and then Otto Kern worked for other German. Fran, who's in charge of chassis group there? Over Otto Rasmussen, that's who it is.
Bill? Or Walt?
No. What was Rasmussen's first name, remember? Fran? Rasmussen, anyway. I worked with him. He's retired now, too, I guess. But I worked, he was number one boss in the department. Then I went to work for John Dodge. That was my final last job. I worked for John Dodge. Well, John Dodge had the squeak and rattle. Yeah, okay. Bob Sinicola was the man I'm trying to remember. Bob Sinicola. He's still there. And he's, I'd say maybe 40 years old now. And I worked for John Dodge and Chris Engel on, I worked for Dodge on squeak and rattle, and Chris Engel was finally on the a liaison job, which I found very interesting, between engineering and production. And whatever problem it might be there, instead of any specific part of the car, it was whatever. And if production had a problem, for instance, being able to put parts together, somebody couldn't get their arm through somewhere, could something else be done? I would go contact the engineer. I'd drag the engineer over the production line, show him that production was having a hard time putting whatever it was together. The engineer would go to the designer, and they'd talk about it a while and decide how they could fix it up, whatever it would be.
Do you remember any specific incident or
Well,
situation?
there was one specific where in the power steering area where the person who had to put a nut on said, can you fix it so that instead of coming from front to back on the nut, I can go from back to front. I can get at it that way. I can see it. It's here at this station. So they had to do some design changing, some casting changes. It got into some pretty heavy, doesn't sound like much, but in order to change the brackets so they'd still go together and all that, we had to go through casting change, and it took months before it could happen on the line because you have this backlog of parts, and they had to build enough backlog so when they took the tools down to change them, they wouldn't run out of parts and so on. But that's the kind of thing. The other thing was air conditioning, tightening the fittings so they wouldn't leak. That was forever a problem. The whole 20 years I worked on it, and then for the next 5 years after that too. All the time. Was there a way to get a quick connect fixture on there? I don't know what they have on there now. I'll have to look at some of the new cars, but I doubt if they got it because they always say, yeah, we'll do it. And by the time they find out it's going to cost them another $5 a car, they just don't do it. Back to nuts and bolts again. So those are the things that you work on like mad, never go anywhere. They stay right in the ash can, so to speak. A lot of things we did like that never went anywhere. Well,
Never
that's what
did
experimental is for.
Yes, never really did find a real fix.
No, not or something that was 100%. When the nuts and bolts or the fittings on an air conditioning system are properly tightened, you can't beat it. We were looking for something that you didn't have to properly tighten them. If you put them together any way at all, if they were together at all, they were together right. There's a saying in engineering to try to make it idiot-proof. The assumption being that the person on the production line is not too smart. Well, I always took the attitude, well, when you make it idiot-proof, you're trying to prove you're not an idiot. That's your job as an engineer. That you're the idiot if you don't make it so it's easy to put together. A guy on a line, 60 cars an hour, I don't know how they stand it. You might as well make it as easy as you can for those people. Well, there's another instance. For example, there was a bracket that had to go from one side of the car to the other. Well, the brackets were either too wide or too narrow. There's first a bunch of cars that come through, and the bracket would be too narrow. Parts were all to print, but the front end of a car, there's quite a bit of variation to it, and the guy on the line was showing me how he had to take a screwdriver and jam it in one hole so he could get a bolt through the other one. He says, can you do something about that?
Now, what was the purpose of that bracket?
Well, stability.
Stability.
Yeah, but the holes never, or wouldn't line up too well. I'll say this for the guys on the line. If engineering couldn't get them out of trouble, they'd get themselves out of trouble. Somehow. I got to give the foreman on the production line every kind of credit, and the personnel on the line too. I'd say that most of them do care. They want a good product out there. Well, when you're doing it all day long, you're not going to send them to a sloppy job. That would imply, how do they live at home? They live sloppy at home. Most of them don't. Mm-hmm. And they take pride in it. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was engineering's job to make it as easy for them to do their job and do it right as we could.
Did you remember testing on the jet fire, a turbocharged engine?
I wasn't in the engine group at that time. The engine that I came to work on was the diesel, and then I saw the demise of the V8 engine. We started working on in fact, we had a V6 diesel floating around, and then we worked on a V5. A lot of work went into that. That never went anywhere.
Why?
Well, if you're going to have a 5, you might as well have a 6. You get these orders from on high. What can you do with a 5? So we got pretty far along in that. We had production people talking. It was all in the talking stage. Nobody bought any tooling yet. But we had a few engines around. They were pretty bad. And they never went any further than bad. The project was just plain dropped. Well, the thing is, diesels were not getting such a good name. Also, fuel prices were going back down again. And so I go through this multi-millions of dollars for tooling to make a 5-cylinder diesel when you had a 6 already.
That wasn't selling.
That was working. The
Oh.
6, yeah, right. The 6 was working. But anyway, the whole business was finally dropped on the 5. And the whole diesel thing has been dropped too.
Mhm.
The 4-cylinder gas engines are now getting 30 miles per gallon, 40, whatever. So, that's my career.
Well, Harold, you've had an exciting career.
It was. It was very...
Then what decided you to get out of the consulting business for the factory?
Well, I was 65 years old at the time, and I said, this time to go.
Mhm.
And it's time to get out of Michigan winter and sliding around on the parking lot and sliding around on my driveway and shoveling a 60-foot driveway. And we came down to Florida to enjoy the climate down here,
Mhm.
basically. And there's got to be some kind of reward. Some people say, well, they'd rather keep working. Well, I didn't do the kind of painting that I'm doing now, creative painting. My creative juices were taken up by Oldsmobile, which was fine. I enjoyed doing that. I tried doing some painting there, but I would always have more than enough to do at work, or I'd be tired, or I'd be out of town a while. And so I did a little bit, and I did some night school. Came down here. I decided that I would become a famous author. Well, after I wrote a bit of stuff and sent it around to places and was rejected by some not very well-known magazines, I decided, well, I'd go top class. So I sent one article off to New Yorker and another one off to Atlantic, and they both rejected me. I figured, well, okay, I've been rejected all the way from top to bottom, to heck with it.
What were those articles about?
Oh, they were about, well, one of them was, I called it Biology 001. And I just made absolute shambles out of biology. It was absolutely supposed to be funny. And I've read it off of my friends and they laughed at it.
Kind of a satire?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Then I did one on psychology, which is easy to satirize, and I did one on history and so on. And first of all, there were going to be articles that, oh, well, maybe I'd make them into chapters and maybe try to sell it. But then I finally decided I'm not getting enough exercise writing, so I'd get back into creative arts. And because you stand up with this, you move around, I'm more active physically. And I got the walls loaded here now with this stuff. In fact, I belong to an art group down here, and they're going to have a parking lot sale next Saturday and Sunday. And that's what that stuff's all laying around here for. I'm going to take that and see what I can do with it.
Oh, well, I think you'll do very well. You certainly is a nice
Incidentally, see that one in the
selection.
corner there? I decided I'd have a little fun with that. I made a little kitty face out of
Oh,
it.
yes, yes.
I took some bottle caps and glued them onto that surface. Here's the next car I want to buy, incidentally. I saw that. That's the transport that
Oh, Pontiac.
Pontiac is putting out.
Oh, yes.
We have a van out here now, a Chevrolet minivan, but I want to buy this as a...
1990 Pontiac Transport SC.
Uh-huh.
Aha.
Chevrolet's going to have one like that, and I understand the Oldsmobile is
Yes.
also into the act.
Right. Yes, they are.
So that'll be what I want to get. So, well, you see what we have for fun out there too, that bug,
Right.
car without a top. We
Look-
take that to the beach. Doesn't go anyplace else.
Looks like fun.
It is. But in order to, stay active mentally at least and so on, this is a change of pace here, but with the paintings and so on, it's given me
I can see it
an
has.
outlet for that.
Great.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Let me ask you about a couple of people now. Did you work with Gib Butler?
I knew him, and I was never in the same department with him, but yeah, I talked to him a number of times, and I saw him the last days I was there at Oldsmobile. He was teaching at the LCC at the time,
Yes.
I understand, yes.
Now, Jack Ridenauer?
Jack Ridenauer, I saw him last week.
Yes. Did
Uh-huh.
you work with him?
I did never work with him, per se,
Mhm.
but we were friends. In fact,
Mhm.
I bought my first television. He was trying to sell it, and I bought it off of Jack.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we were friends through the years.
Jack Diener? No, Jim Diener?
Jim Diener, I knew him to talk to, and howdy,
Mhm.
and that was all, yeah.
Mhm. You mentioned George Hirschman.
Yes.
What kind of a man was he to work
I
with?
enjoyed working for him. He became assistant administrative engineer eventually. Well, he was my first boss, and he was the one that gave me the lowdown on what to do and so on. In fact, I still remember one comment of his. I had to get something done in one of the other departments. Although we were called clerks, we were beyond that level. We were all college graduate engineers anyway. And I had to get something done in the experimental assembly department, and Mr. Elgin Neff wasn't going to do it my way. And I went back to George and says, I'm just not getting any cooperation. And George says, I'm going to tell you something. He says, if you can't work with them, he says, work around them. And I remember that comment since about 1951. Work with them, work around them. So that was good advice from George. So we got along on a, if you want to say, on a fatherly basis from him to me. He wasn't that much older than I would say. Well, he's got to be about 80 by now, I would guess. But still, it was enjoyable working for George. Yeah.
Was Bob Stemple there when you were there?
Bob Stemple was there. Yeah, I knew him to howdy. But I'm very pleased to see he's president of the corporation. He's an engineer. He's a car man. He's approachable. I think he's going to be going to kick that corporation right along the way I'd like to see it go.
The loyalty is still there.
100%.
How many years were you there?
Well, I was there from if you take all the years from 1950 until 1987, 50 to 87, yeah. Minus 10 months off for good behavior.
Oh, yes.
I started out working for General Motors the summer of 1942 at Turnstedt Division on 4th Street in Detroit, where I grew up.
Oh, what
I
were
worked
you
there
doing?
that summer. In the plant layout department. I'd gone to college for a year by then.
Which college did you go to?
Wayne State University, or it was called Wayne University at the time. That was the poor people's university. It cost $50 a semester, $100 a year to go there. And most of us lived at home. In fact, all of us. There was no.
Do you remember what you were hired in for? 42?
You mean for?
What salary?
Yes, I remembered very clearly. 90 cents an hour, and I was proud because the last job I'd had paid 60 cents an hour. And I lasted exactly 45 minutes at it. The job was pickling steel rods over a sulfuric acid bath. And I thought I was going to have to do that. It was the summertime. I had to make enough money to go to college again the next fall of 42. I say 45 minutes. I walked in. I said, I just cannot take this. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I can't do this. 2 weeks later, I got a check sent to me for 45 cents.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Forget it. I said, I don't need any of this. But now they clear their records anyway. So then I worked, yes, as I say, for 60 cents for a horrible job to 90 cents working as an engineer.
What did you hire in at Oldsmobile?
$290 a month. And I had worked my way through school at Michigan State University, working for the power plant, for the Board of Water and Light.
I see. And your degree was in?
Mechanical engineering.
I see.
From Michigan State University. I collected some credits from Wayne State. Finished up at Michigan State College,
right,
which changed its name later.
Well, Harold, you had an illustrious career.
Well, I've had fun.
And it shows too.
I enjoyed Oldsmobile. That was my career. And when I went to work in 42 for Turnstedt Division, I liked the way General Motors did things right there. I worked for them for 3 months and I enjoyed it very much. And I was well paid, considering. And I decided when I graduated from college, that's where I was going to go to work. And if you graduate from college in Lansing, there's Oldsmobile.
Right. And that had a prestige.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes.
But let me ask you, then were you in the service?
Yes, I was. 3 years in the Air Force. And the Air Force turned me into an airplane mechanic. So, I'd gone to college for a year by then. And so being a mechanic was not totally unallied from being an engineer.
True.
Yeah. I went to airplane mechanic school in Gulfport, Mississippi in the summer. In Gulfport, Mississippi in the summer, in a reclaimed swamp, in an air-conditioned barracks, is just plain hot. To school from 3 in the afternoon until 9 o'clock at night, 6 days a week. And we would start at one end of a barracks that had been converted into classrooms, and every day we would move ahead one classroom. The 6th room, then the next, we'd go to the next building and come down that one. And we would learn all the bits and pieces of an airplane. So,
Then when you came back to Oldsmobile, the war was over?
well, yeah, I got out of the service in '46 and then went back to
yes.
school and so finished up and happy then.
So you were always on automobile work?
Oh yeah, yes, as an engineer, right.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we've got this. I
Okay.
think we've